This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. So if you're a beginner or an expert or anyone in between, you've found your new home. Welcome to Identity at the Center. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. Hey, I've got some folks here working on my oven. So I've got like a double oven that's kind of built in, which basically means just like screwed into the cabinetry. But I'd never seen it removed from the wall until today. And it was removed from the wall.
How gross was it back there?
What I saw was that the original installer, I guess, didn't have enough wire. So rather than putting a cut in the wall to lower the point at which the wire comes out, they just kind of ripped it down. And it's a total mess. And it kind of came to my mind. It's like, have some pride in your work. You know, do the things that you need to do, take the extra time and do it right. You know, I think that's good career advice, especially for anybody who's just starting out. No matter what you do, like if you write documentation, just don't take the shortcuts just because you think somebody's not watching or not going to see or it's not going to matter. Do things with the right level of quality, man. It's like, now I looked at that and I'm like, I don't know who did that work, but whoever did it just doesn't care.
Well, I agree with you, right? You should be doing good work all the time. But I mean, there's times you take shortcuts, right? I mean, we're just humans. Like, you don't have enough time. You wish you had more time on something. You wish you maybe had more information, whatever it may be. I mean, it's not probably not the same as ripping drywall. I'm assuming is what you mean, with like cable coming through to reach the oven. But yeah, do good work. But I don't know.
I think it's an attitude, and I think you like to take the other side of the coin.
I do. I love to.
But if I was making the case that, hey, just take a shortcut, just do garbage work, you would counsel me to do the opposite.
Yes,
take the time, do things right, because especially when somebody's eventually going to be your customer, it's like, to do a shoddy job is just not acceptable.
You have to be ready to accept the ramifications of that work, right? If you're okay with hey, this is going to be really crappy wiring, but it's going to go behind an oven and nobody will probably see it for 20 years. Is that person going to still be around and care? Maybe not, but maybe you're writing a report or you're doing, some documentation or something. And, the one time you need it, and it's not there, or some user is relying on it, right? And it's like, I kind of skipped it on this one. Sure. Yeah, I think the moral of the story is everything has a consequence. And if you should be prepared for whatever the consequences are of whatever you're putting out into the world. How does that sound?
I'm going to say that I think the moral of the story is the true test of character is doing things the right way, even when you don't think somebody's watching.
When nobody's looking. Yeah. All right. Well, you're a better person than I am, for sure, then.
I thought we established that. Where are we on episode 300 now?
This is 209. And we're just now figuring it out that Jeff likes to work smart, not hard.
I've got an 18-year-old, and he said to me the other day, I'm going to work smart. I'm like, son, you're 18 years old. You need to work smart and hard. That's the ticket, smart and hard.
And often.
Yes, working smart is important, but you're only 18. If you think you can get by working 2-3 hours a day and sleeping till 11 o'clock, I'm here to tell you, man, that's not going to work. That's not a path to success.
All right, well, let's move on, because I don't think anyone's going to get anything out of this intro conversation between us, our stupid banter. Why don't we talk about Identiverse? That's coming up. We have a partnership that we're doing with the Identiverse folks. So Identiverse 2023 is heading to Vegas. Join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 30th to June 2nd. Jim and I are both going to be there, right, Jim?
That's absolutely right. Unless my flight gets canceled.
No, you better show up, because we're going to do some live recording there and some live podcasts, part of the welcome ceremony stuff we're working out. But if you're not familiar with Identiverse, it's the must-attend annual event that brings together over 2,500 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouth. It's a mountain. It's a mouthful. It's everything. But here's the good news. If you are an Identity at the Center listener, you get 20% off of your Identiverse 2023 tickets using code IDV23-ICEN20. It just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it, Jim?
Absolutely. I think the good news is I'll be there. You'll be there. Our guest today, David Mahdi, will be there. There's going to be lots of people from the IAM industry or digital identity industry, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's the who's who of identity will be there. You definitely want to register, identiverse.com. Today, when people are hearing this for the first time, it'll be April 24th, and there's only 3 days left of the early bird discount, which ends on April 27th. So make sure you maximize as many discounts as you can. Use our code. I'll have a link in our show notes with both the code as well as a very handy link. You can just click it, and it'll populate it automatically. And we hope to see everyone at Identiverse. So we're planning on doing like this welcome reception sort of live podcast recording, 7 p.m. Tuesday night, which is the 30th. And we're supposed to be kind of like just outside the welcome area. So hopefully people come check us out. And we should have plenty of good guests like our friend, David Mahdi, who's going to join us here. We're going to talk a little bit about the fusion of cybersecurity and identity. Very heady title. But joining us today for the first time is David Mahdi. He's the CIO at Transmit Security. He's also a former Gartner analyst. He's also an incredibly gifted axe thrower, in case you didn't know that. And he's joining us all the way from Ottawa, Canada. Welcome to the show, David.
Jeff, Jim, thank you so much for having me here today. It's definitely an honor and a pleasure. And thank you for those kind words about the axe throwing that we, for some of our listeners, maybe they were there. That was at the Gartner Identity and Access Management Summit where you guys hosted an axe throwing event.
Yeah, it was very cool.
Nobody got hurt.
Nobody got hurt.
No one got hurt.
Yeah,
no one
it was
got hurt.
fun. I think, David, if this identity thing doesn't work out, I feel like there's some people in that room that were throwing axes that could probably turn pro. And I don't know if I should be impressed or scared or a little bit of both.
I know, right? It's true. It's true. It was, it was fun. And they did a good job too of having different games. It wasn't just about hitting the targets. They had all sorts of different games of getting targets, different numbers. And yeah, it was a good night, but we can't forget at that venue, they had a lot of old school arcade games. And you guys were gracious enough to have these gift cards or the cards at the door. And I was like a kid in a candy store because when I swiped one of them, I think it was on Terminator 2. I was with like the two Uzis.
Yeah.
And it was like 4 hours. So it wasn't credits. It was like by time. And I'm like, what do you mean I have 4 hours? I'm like, this is insane. And I remember that machine as a kid. I was like, I can't remember how many quarters I pumped in or tokens I pumped into that machine. And I was going around, it was like Simpsons, Pinball, Street Fighter 2, even like really old school games too. I think the Asteroid was there, Centipede, on and on. I don't know if you guys had a chance to play the arcade games, but I definitely spent some time there.
Yeah, I went over one of my favorite games coming up was track and field. And so there's two versions of track and field. One where you have the ball where you spin the ball fast and then your guy runs. And most people can get that ball spinning pretty fast, but you would get the blister on your finger. The version they had at the gaming bistro was the one where you tap the buttons, and that's how you move your legs and run fast. So
yeah, it's like left, right was a button.
Yeah, two of the folks that were there, they were like, one of them was hitting one button, the other was hitting the other button. I was like, you guys are like we were teenagers, like totally cheating to try and win this video game. I mean, it was funny.
Well, the whole point of that game was you're supposed to bring like a pencil or a pen or something, and you'd hit one button so that then the momentum would do the other button because it's supposed to be like left, right, and the whole point was to do a pattern. Yeah. I sucked at that game. I could not play that game to save my life. Certainly got into Street Fighter. I was a little bummed that the controller didn't work very well. Yeah. So trying to do my dragon punches with Ken and Ryu just wasn't happening. But overall, it was a very cool time. For our first ever Identity at the Center listener meetup, and getting the sponsors that we did. Again, thanks to RSM and One Cosmos and Okta for helping us put that together. It was very cool. So hopefully we'll be able to do something like that in the future.
100%. But yeah, definitely excited to be here today. I know we're going to get into some interesting topics, and can't wait to get going here.
Yeah, so it's your first time. We have a ritual, tradition, a grilling, whatever you want to call it. How did you get into identity? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Oh, I would say it chose me. I started out in defense and then got into training electrical engineering, software engineering, and then got into malware, web security, email security, all that stuff when it was called viruses at the time. And then I joined a company called Entrust, learned a lot about PKI and discovered that, cryptography and all this actually lends itself very well to identity. But really, if you go back, almost 20 years ago with PKI, most people were just using it for authentication. But it was mostly websites, right? So what we would call that today is machine identity. But back then it was just, you need a certificate for a website. So your browser can allow people to establish a TLS or SSL session, right? And that's how I kind of got into it a little bit. And as I spent more time, started to get into human identity stuff, national identities, worked on a lot of the passports, that kind of stuff. And then got sucked into workforce and consumer identity even further, in joining another companies after that and all that. So yeah, so I guess it chose me in a sense, or pulled me into its gravity center.
That's my prevailing thought. Is I think, maybe this is part of our age bracket. Is for the most part, I feel like the older folks in the biz, identity chose them. And I don't know if they necessarily had a choice. It was just kind of like, hey, you're doing this now.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it worked. Who knows, right? Every once in a while, we see that real weirdo who chose identity, and we love them for it. That's great. So now you're with Transmit Security, and you're a CIO at Transmit Security. What does a CIO do for a identity technology company? So 2 questions.
Yeah.
What does CIO do? And then 2, for those who aren't familiar with Transmit, what do you guys do?
Okay. So great question. So CIO, it's actually a really, I think, awesome title, fun title, and something that I think a lot of us identirati, if you will, that's what we called identity folks at Gartner, by the way, Chief Identity Officer. So the notion is kind of being an evangelist, going to events, working closely with a lot of my former colleagues and analysts, understanding what we're seeing in the market from an analyst perspective, going out and doing a lot of kind of CIO, CISO advisory work as well. So I've been doing that for a long time. And a lot of it is even agnostic too, but meeting with some of these folks, seeing what their problems are, and then looking at Transmit Security and saying, how can we help solve these problems? Whether it's us, whether it's some of our partners, or even the community as well. I'm a big fan of, obviously, networking and people make things happen. And when people know people and who's good at what, that makes the world go around. So even with some of our clients, connecting them with each other so that they can share knowledge, share experiences. But so that's kind of my role in a nutshell at Transmit Security. What does Transmit Security do? So, I mean, look, I'll talk about what Transmit does, but I'll also say why I joined, right? So as a former Gartner analyst, I had the privilege to be able to work with lots of different organizations around the world, from investors to the tech providers themselves, your tech titans, to all of the usual suspects in the identity space and cybersecurity space, as well as large banks, large enterprises, large retailers, and all kinds of organizations under the sun. And you get a really good view of all that stuff. I always say the analogy is like, as an analyst, you're like someone who's sitting in the bleachers watching the game. And if you're a consultant, if you're an investor, if you're a practitioner, you're a vendor, you're on the field playing the game. And I was watching the game. Now, I like playing the sport, right? So I was at Gartner for almost 7 years, and I saw Transmit Security a long time ago, and I thought, okay, these guys were doing some cool things. They were doing, before it was even kind of known to be something, identity orchestration. And, kept my eye on them. I'm like, okay, former founders of Trusteer and Imperva and a whole raft of cybersecurity and identity companies under their belt. And I'm like, okay, that's a company to watch, just because the team, they've done some things that have been very cool in the past. Keep an eye on them. watch the market, see where it goes. And then they showed us like, hey, we'll work with a bank that has over 400 identity silos. And in all those silos, you've got breadcrumbs of one consumer, one user in all these silos. How do you bring this together? Some of this is legacy tech. Some of it's, maybe a little bit newer. Some it's a little bit older. How do you bring all this together? Sure. Some of it was using open standards and some of it not. So you needed to be able to effectively almost log into each one of these things. So Transmit was one of the first to say, we need orchestration. You need a nice visual interface to be able to hook into all these applications to give an identity leader or a security leader a singular view of a user to know, what they're doing, if they're calling into a call center, if they're using a mobile app, or they're using a website, or using a combination thereof. So they were first to market with that, and Ant Allen and I nominated them and they were selected to be a cool vendor a few years ago. And then they, started focusing on doing orchestration within passwordless, and now really broadening out, focusing on consumer identity access management and business to business as well, but not going after workforce. And I guess just with the topic we want to talk about today and linking those together, what really pulled me over to Transmit was just the vision for today and the future. And that is the fusion of identity and cybersecurity. Because when you look at the heritage of the team, if I start with that, it's all cybersecurity people, fraud analysts, military backgrounds, deep cybersecurity expertise, and then they also have a lot of identity experts. And what I noticed also as a Gartner analyst, one of the things I was charged with was looking at the convergence of identity and cybersecurity with data security tools and other security tools as well. And I think we've crossed the chasm now, where even I know I saw both of you at the Gartner conference. For me, that Gartner conference, the Identity and Access Management conference, the recent one in Grapevine, Texas, to me, it almost felt more like a cybersecurity conference than an identity conference. And I think these worlds are coming together. Even the name of your podcast, Identity at the Center, cybersecurity people are getting that memo now, finally, that you have to start with identity, whether it's a human, a machine, an application. What is it? What can it do? And can you trust it? And then everything wraps around that. Without doing that, without knowing who and what you're dealing with, I don't understand what kind of security policy you can apply. So I guess to kind of summarize what Transmit does, we focus on identity and cybersecurity, focus purely on kind of consumer identity access management, but bringing that kind of fraud detection, looking at bad bots, looking at all these things, but also focus on the user experience and delivering that to organizations. Anyway, I'll stop there. It was very long-winded.
So you mentioned something there that always piques my interest, and that's the mention of a cool vendor. Mm-hmm. What does that mean to be a cool vendor? Like, who is the arbiter of, this vendor is cool and this one is not? And I guess, I don't know if you can talk about it. I know this is like a Gartner thing, but what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be a cool vendor? Oh,
it's a secret. I could tell you, but I'd have to
All right. I don't want you or Henrique or Becky or anybody else getting mad at me, so that's fine.
No. So look, I mean, cool vendors are really just that. So a couple of things, and this could also be a PSA for some of the tech providers that are out there. Gartner has a number of different cool vendor categories. So, if it's in cloud or cloud storage or data security or endpoint security. So that for various topics. And of course, those areas also evolve as those markets evolve. So and in the case for Transmit, it was in identity and access management. In the past, they used to do one a year, one cool vendor report a year. And then because there's just so much innovation in IT, but also in cybersecurity and identity in general, they're like, you know what, I think we need to do this twice a year because there's so many vendors we would nominate. From a very high level, how it works is analysts get briefed. We would do hundreds of briefings a year. And you don't have to be a customer to do a briefing. You just can email vendor.briefings@gartner.com, submit a briefing, and then you eventually pick a date. On obviously, if you are a customer, there's ways to link your account and do everything so you get one view and all that kind of stuff. But I won't get into that. But anyone can do a briefing, and you would kind of do your briefing with an analyst, show them what you're doing. Ideally, you are presenting to them, not giving them your story from when you were a child and all that stuff, which we would see a lot of the time. And sometimes it makes sense if they can connect the dots, but other times you're like, okay, I just want to know what you do, how you do it, what makes you unique, and is there anyone using it right now? And there are a lot of
very much like Shark Tank.
It's not unlike Shark Tank, yes, right? Except I would say we're much nicer, and then we don't have piles of cash behind us. So that's the difference. But obviously, getting that cool vendor accolade it can translate into, if it's used well, it is valued in the industry. Investors really do pay attention to that. There was one report, and you could talk to Becky and Henrique and Mike Kelly and some of my former colleagues, where it was like, you had to tell the vendors, like, guys, can you stop buying all of the vendors? Like, right after we publish a report, they all get acquired. It's like, can we give them a chance to actually, show some success on their own? But let me just wrap this one up here. So really, there's no explicit criteria. It's just usually we get exposed to someone who we think is cool. They're doing cool things, and some of the stuff is in production. And an analyst would just kind of keep their eye on them, much like myself and Antalon did for Transmit. And then we nominate them internally. Think of it like a call for papers internally, and we would nominate them, and then it goes into kind of a Gartner process where we would argue, debate, and do all sorts of things. And what comes out on the other end is a list of vendors that we would say, hey, these are actually good choices for candidates. And look, I've nominated tons of vendors in the past, and my experience has been the ones that have been selected, the ones that I've been a part of having them selected, were the ones that always nailed the use cases. They had production. There's so many cool ones that you're like, that's very cool what you're doing. Who's using it? And you're like, no one really. Like, okay, give me a call when someone's using it. Stay in touch. But I really want to know. And I think there was Alter. That was one vendor that I nominated. They do like kind of blockchain data security stuff. Although they probably kill me for saying that now. But that was one of the missing links, was production clients. And then that allowed me to kind of, push them. Transmit Security was pretty straightforward because they had customers almost from day one. And so it was pretty straightforward for Antalon and I to say, hey, they're doing something cool. They've got a customer base, and we went from there. So yeah, so that's it's a kind of one of those things that we see out there, but we don't know what's behind it. It does actually, in my opinion, if you see it, it's something to take note of a vendor if you're looking at them.
Well, I like hearing behind the scenes stories like that to be able to kind of help understand what does it actually mean. We want to talk about cybersecurity, identity, and sort of fusing the two. But I was looking, doing some research before we started, and I didn't realize this, but you wrote a book, The Art of Selling Cybersecurity. And we're not going to, sell the book or anything like that right now. We'll have it in our show notes. But I looked at the review, and there was one person who wrote a 1-star review by the name of Marcel, who was very disappointed. Hadn't even read the book yet. Was very disappointed that there was no table of contents.
Yeah.
Has that been fixed?
That has been fixed.
Have happy reading, all that stuff.
Yeah. So shout out to the lead author there, Mahdi Raza. He was a champion of bringing that together. But yeah, to Marcel, that has been fixed. And I think it was fixed like pretty quickly after we saw that comment. And it was just an ebook thing, because the print version never had that issue. And I think after I saw that, I went and I made sure I downloaded the Kindle version. I think that may have been the problem. And I saw it, and then I think it was fixed. So that kind of thing, hopefully, we see those things get fixed. But, just a quick note on the book, why I jumped in on that project. It was just the team. It was a solid team. So look, there's a bazillion sales books out there for all sorts of things, right? The angle that book took was we had a number of CISOs join us to say, what worked for you when you bought software? You tell us what a successful deal looks like from the CISO security team's perspective. not some sales guru telling you what to do. Although there's merit in that, absolutely. We did have some of those folks on there too, but that's kind of the different angle. And one of my friends who's in the identity space, who will go unnamed, I think he said when he looked at the book, like he's like, the epiphany he had was not just about being sold to from vendors, but it was him being the identity champion within his organization and selling identity within the organization. Because let's be honest, to many of our listeners, you always have to be selling. You have to be selling yourself. You got to be selling your identity programs. And it's not easy. It's not easy to get some of these things off the ground. So you need to be able to sell. So part of the book also covers some of that too, and selling themselves, selling the programs they have to push and all this. Because look, no one wants to do multi-factor authentication. So you got to sell that, right? Like, I mean, you're asking people to do more work for what would seem trivial, but they don't know. So it's on you to sell. So that was kind of the angle of it. But yeah.
Yeah, if you wait to the point where it's easy to sell, it's like you waited too long.
Yeah.
It's easy to sell multi-factor authentication within your organization now, because if you haven't done it already, like, oh my gosh.
That's a good point. Your insurers are probably making you do it anyway.
Yeah, so exactly.
You've been responsible for the cool vendor moniker. What about the cool podcast moniker? Where is this a cool podcast?
I think so. Look, I mean, I have to give you guys huge kudos, because look, the identity space was one that has always been kind of in the basement, right? Where it's like, well, what is identity? It's just joiner, mover, lever. Like, that's it. That's important. But, now even when we talk about it coming into cybersecurity, everyone knows cybersecurity is hot and everyone cares about cybersecurity, but identity is being pulled into that. And we're seeing it now, I think, all over the place. When I have friends that aren't even in our space at all, and they're asking me questions about, passkeys. Like, I heard this thing called passkeys. What is it? What's passwordless authentication? I can see that I can scan my driver's license now to get onboarded. Like, what does that mean? Tell me what's going on behind the scenes. I'm like, this is really cool. Like, finally, all this stuff that we've been doing for decades is like coming into the limelight. So, so I think that's one of the things that I have to give kudos to you guys for kind of continuing that momentum and spreading the good word. And the more the merrier, right? I think the more we have of these types of things, and the fact that you guys have also latched on to doing that great interview on stage at Gartner, and then doing your work with Identiverse and even Authenticate later on in the year. So kudos to you guys.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I asked that question for two reasons. One was to stroke my ego and stroke Jeff's ego. The second reason was as kind of a lead into our main topic. Because I think, look, the podcast is called Identity at the Center. And I feel like, or I don't feel like, but I'm concerned that we're creating a bit of an echo chamber. All of our guests are people in the identity and access management industry. Jeff and I are in the identity and access management industry. We all agree identity and access management is the most important idea that's ever graced humankind, right?
Yes.
But no, I mean, so I reached out to you and said, David, I want to have you on the podcast. What's the topic? And so what we got to was what you proposed was the fusing of cybersecurity and identity. That is how cybersecurity players are looking at identity. And similarly with IAM players, also known as Gartner's Identity First Security.
Yep.
And, you, me, and Jeff all agree. Identity First Security, identity is at the center. Little concerned that maybe and the other one is identity is the new perimeter.
Yes.
It's like, are we creating an echo chamber? Does the rest of the world, information security, cybersecurity players, do they truly think like, oh, everything we've been doing in the past is actually wrong or changing, and now identity is the most important thing?
Yeah.
So what am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think identity has evolved. It's evolving, and it has evolved in many ways. Look, IT was always focused on just productivity, right? Getting you new tools, having you do all this. And IAM came in to, actually, I gave a presentation yesterday, and it was looking back to look forward. It was just saying, if you go back to the 90s, we started rolling out applications within organizations. Every application had its own identity store. Well, obviously, that we knew we were going to get to a point where people couldn't log in and have, independent identity stores in every app. How do you hire someone and then, they change change roles, and now you have all these orphaned accounts, right? So that changed, and we had the birth of directories. Again, all of this stuff was built for productivity. And that was back in the time where we were like, hey, everyone loves us. No one's going to do any harm. Just let them in. It's fine. I mean, there's a reason why cybersecurity has taken so long to get where it is today. What I tell people today is I'm a cybersecurity and identity professional. I started my career out in security, in defense, and I got into identity after. But even the identity kind that I got into personally was more of like PKI crypto. And then I learned all the other like governance and all the other bits and pieces after. That was my view. I mean, some people say, well, we're always doing identity because we have Active Directory integration. You're like, okay, no, that's not identity. It's a little part of it, but it's not identity. So I think now I would actually just disagree with you. I understand the concern. It's good to have that concern, but I think now we're getting to the point, and that's why why I propose the term fusion, because once we fuse these things together, the market's so big. Sure, you can have specialists that still do some identity functions, that still do discrete cybersecurity functions. But as a whole, to a CISO, to a CIO, to an organization and their board who care about cybersecurity now, identity is inseparable from it. It needs to be fused in order to be successful as a digital organization going forward and protect privacy of your customers, your employees, all your constituents. These two things have to be fused. You cannot, I mean, look, the case in point, like the vast majority of all the attacks are identity. A ransomware attack. I tell people, I'm like, that's not a malware issue. And they look at me like I'm a madman. I'm like, it's not a malware issue. It uses malware, right? It is a piece of malware, but it's actually what it's exploiting is rights and entitlements of your users. Period, full stop. If you have right-size access and you block out critical things, and you're monitoring behavior of those users, you can catch these things. And by the way, I had over 36, 37 engagements with customers when I was at Gartner that caught ransomware, and they caught it because they shrunk the attack surface because they did right-size access for everybody. And then they were monitoring user behavior. And when they saw that one case was a user would access maybe say 100 files an hour. And then this one user was accessing 30,000 files in less than 5 minutes. Okay, maybe they're migrating something, but they're like, all right, what's going on here? And they're like, oh, it's actually encrypting. It's going through and encrypting stuff. You can't catch that if you are just looking at malware, and you can't catch that if you're just looking at MFA and SSO. Like, you're going to miss it. So you got to bring those two worlds together. So I could go on, but a ransomware to me is a good one.
I think you're making great points. I think the shift to the cloud, does that sound like super generic or what? But the shift to the cloud, especially to software as a service, has been the number one driver of, you hear the term identity is the new perimeter. And it's like, yeah, but nobody's turning off their firewalls. However, if you have Salesforce applications or Workday or things like that, the part of security that you can control is the identity. And if you have good controls over your identity, you can keep your applications secure. And if you don't have good controls over your identity, I'm sorry, but you cannot keep that's a nuance, right? So I kind of feel like
100%.
That nuance, though, it's important. People have to understand that so that they don't dismiss, the soundbite of identity as the new perimeter.
Yeah, I agree, because look, we could get lost. Like, zero trust is one of them. You know, I love the concept. I'm a fan of NIST 800-207. I'm totally nerding out there. And shout out to like Chase Cunningham, because I love the work that and John Kinnervag, like all the work that they have done. But the problem I saw with it was, Jim, to your point with like identity is the new perimeter, is that people get sucked into the moniker. And what I've seen, especially with zero trust, is lazy logic and going, well, I don't need to trust anything. I'm like, okay, no, that's not what it means. That's not what it means. Like, I always say this, I said this on stage many times, and I knew I was presenting to lots of financial institutions. I'm like, you guys have to do KYC, right? Know your customer? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, think about the language there for a moment. You have to know your customer. You can't be like, oh, zero trust, don't let you in, right? You have to establish and maintain trust with your customers and their devices and all the software applications they use to connect into your digital services. And so to me, that does come back to identity is the new perimeter, because that is the common thread for humans and machines. And I love the point you made, Jim. It's like, look, we know, the odds are against us, okay? We got hybrid multi-cloud environments for most modern enterprises. We've got hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of applications running. And each one of those applications has millions of lines of code. It's just probability. Like, the odds are against you. You will have breaches. You will have vulnerabilities. You will have people penetrate into your network. So the game has to be about resiliency. And that resiliency has to start with identity at the center. Like, if you know who and what you're dealing with, that's always the best place to go back to whenever there's issues, right? You can shut everything down, but make sure you can onboard your users, reset their accounts, get them back online as quickly as you can, because yes, applications will be vulnerable, operating systems will fail. And that's just the nature. Anyone who hasn't recognized that now, is like they're fooling themselves. And again, it goes back to the fusion of identity and cybersecurity. And again, I think Henrique said it at the conference. He said SolarWinds, going back a few years ago, the SolarWinds attack, that was a wake-up call for IAM professionals. Because it's like, those tokens, I mean, you want to own a network, you do your recon, you're like, oh, using SAML assertions. I'm like, I can break that. And send fake ones through, right? So anyway, I'm blabbling on.
I think that sometimes the podcast for me becomes like the airing of grievances, Festivus. My grievance that I'm airing here, I think, is and you brought it up perfectly, zero trust. Because I've had CISOs or people who work for the CISO, don't put zero trust in that deck because, he's sick of hearing about zero trust. It's like, that's one of the most important concepts for information security that's come our way in the past 20 years. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's at the level of least privilege, right? It's that important.
Yeah.
And identity at the new perimeter isn't at that level of importance, but it's significant, right? It's meant to be brief and to the point so that it sinks in. But the problem is, like, when you hear it over and over again, and it's on every marketing slick, it just becomes noise. It becomes annoying. Exactly. And it becomes like you just don't want to hear it anymore. And I don't have a solution.
Well,
but I do think it's an issue.
Well, who do we blame for this, though? Like, we've got a vendor in front of us here, Jim. Like, it's, I feel like this is something where every vendor in the identity space latched on to SEO and said, oh, zero trust is hot right now. Let's do that. And now, I was at RSA last year. If I took anything away from that conference, it was that, zero trust is solved because there is a product now for everything that I need to do for zero trust.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, look, I'll comment on certainly what I've seen, and then vendors I've advised and organizations I've advised. It's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, we even saw this with cloud. When we were trying to figure out what that was, they were like, oh, it's IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Okay, that's cloud. But even still today, when people say cloud, you're like, what do you really mean when you're saying that? And it's the same thing with zero trust or any of these big terms. You have to understand the client's understanding. So I'm a big fan of definitions to make sure that when we talk about something, you're talking about apples, I'm talking about apples. Let's make sure we're on the same page before we move ahead with this conversation. But yeah, I mean, look, I think the conundrum is the vendors, want to use it, the SEO perspective. If they're not using it, it can be problematic because sometimes you get people who are just saying, and companies did have this. I mean, IBM told me anecdotally a couple of years ago, they ran a survey. It was like 51% or 52% of the people they surveyed liked Zero Trust, the moniker, and the rest, 48% said no, they hate it because it's been overused. So they're like, well, what do you do? So something like, we just have to begrudgingly use the term, maybe not overplay our hand there, but use the term so we get people, but let's try and make sense of it. But I think, look, there's no one now in today's day and age with most segments of identity and cybersecurity that are purely greenfield. Everyone has overlap. And so that's also part of this too, is that, everyone can argue their piece of the puzzle for Zero Trust that they solve. And by the way, there's no one Zero Trust vendor. If you look at NIST 800-207, it's the framework, there's a control plane, and on the left-hand side and right-hand side of the core architecture, if you scroll down several pages into the documentation, there's identity management, there's PKI, there's SIM, there's data access, right? No one does all of that in one product. So, you can say we do Zero Trust identity management, or we follow Zero Trust principles. Great. But that's all you can say, right? So unfortunately, there's going to be more of this. Maybe not Zero Trust, but it's like, what's the term going to be next year, right? And the year after.
I already called it was on negative trust, so that's mine.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Like, it'll be interesting at Identiverse. I know you guys will be there, and I think this will be a great topic for you guys to look at. Like, what's going to be prominent on the show floor? Is there going to be something you're going to go around? I will venture to say that we're going to see a lot of ITDR, identity threat detection and response, whatever that's going to mean to everyone, because everyone has different definitions. I think, Jim, that one's going to be the next one, and the next Zero Trust, at least in the identity space.
I can get behind that. I think ITDR is about to have a moment. Seems to me like it's a little bit of I don't know if rehash is the right word, but something like UABA and UBA from 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, right? It's like, okay, great idea. Let's use behavior analytics and take all this data that we're collecting through our IGA and PAM and access management platforms and do stuff with it.
Yeah,
big fan. Always been a big fan. But I don't think I don't think organizations were ready for that. I mean, we're still seeing organizations that are doing things by hand. They fax in someone's onboarding and offboarding, right? They're sending a message to someone. It's not automated, right? Things like that. And you need a baseline of data and solid processes to make those behavior analytics work effectively.
Yeah.
At least I'm excited to see this time around if it catches on a little bit better. I hope we're better along organizationally at large of being able to take advantage of things like that. I want to point back to one thing you said, because I'm a big fan of level setting. And when you said you have to define, are we using the same definitions of what we're talking about? I think that is a huge point, because there is so much context that sometimes goes into things where you and I can be talking about similar things, but similar is not the same. And that can lead to a lot of questions, concerns, things like that. So I just wanted to point that out, that I'm a big fan of, are we talking about the same thing or not? And, this goes back to the conversation we had, 50 episodes ago, where we said, what's the difference between digital identity and identity and access management? And we got, really smart people who are in the biz and have been around for a while. Guess what? Nobody had the same definition. Yeah. Everyone had a different definition, which I thought was really interesting. So I think that's still something that, we as a community still need to think about. And I'm a fan of context. It depends on who you're talking to. When I say IAM, if I'm talking to David Mahdi, that's going to mean one thing. Yep. If I'm talking to my wife or Jim's dad, as we like to throw out as an example, it's going to mean something different, right?
Yep.
So I think you have to be able to know that context for the conversation and use those context clues to make sure that you are speaking, the same language, not a similar language.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree, because I mean, a lot of my presentations, depending on what it is, I will usually start start with definitions. It's like, I know this might seem boring. I know you might seem like you know it, but there's one actually. I'm going to be delivering a presentation at Identityverse, sorry, on Chat GPT and what it has to do with kind of identity and security and what our threat researchers are seeing with it. And a part of that presentation, I define what it is, because, especially with a topic like that, especially with the hotter the topic, or the moniker, I think sometimes the more divergent the definitions are. I saw it as an analyst. I saw it happen with cloud. I saw it happen with zero trust. And even John Watts, shout out to John Watts, Gartner analyst. He was the lone zero trust wolf at the Gartner IAM conference. And I asked him, he's like, I spent a lot of time just having to just like kind of peel it back and then get people to buy into the definition we have together, and then we can march forward. Right. So it really, I think kudos to you guys for focusing on that too. And I think that will give you guys a lot of wiggle room too with future podcasts. You just pick the moniker du jour.
Yeah. Well, I already trademarked Identity at the Center. I got to do like AI at the center or something at some point.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
So I wanted to actually change the topic completely. And I know a lot of folks listen to the podcast when they're out for their walk. They do a 45-minute walk, and we're probably around that time at this point. This will be the next night.
Just walk farther. Walk farther.
Walk farther.
Walk farther.
It's good for you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick your brain. So put your analyst hat back on.
Okay.
And I want to talk about, we go back and forth. This is something that we spend so much time talking about on this podcast, the difference between IAM and CIAM. IAM being, workforce, enterprise, CIAM being customer, citizen, constituent, however you want to define it, which even those are quite different, but a lot of the same use cases. Enterprise has a lot of similar use cases, B2E. CIAM, B2C has a lot of similar use cases, whether it's citizens or customers, right? There's the registration, authentication, et cetera.
Yep.
The one, like, which of these ones is not like the others is B2B. And what I want to ask you is, so now you got B2E, B2C, and B2B. What's B2B more like? Is it like B2E or B2C?
I think it's smack in the middle. Because look, let's just go to the edges. Let's just say it's a spectrum that goes from left to right. And the spectrum that we're going to measure on here would be like how much control that you would have. Now, if you're an employee, it depends on the jurisdiction you're working in, but if it's the United States or Canada or most of the West, you sign an employee agreement. And so if the organization wants you to wear a clown wig when you come in, as long as it's not violating any privacy rights or whatever, you have to wear a clown wig when you come into work because that's what they're asking you to do. If I put that into identity terms, it might mean thou shall use a smart card to log in. Thou shall, have to authenticate to every single application every single time you go in. That's the policy. That's what they have. Or we've shut down USB access to your machine, and you can whine and complain about it. If you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. You can go work at another company, right? So that's the deal when it comes to B2E. If we go B2C, whether it's citizen or consumer, if you're an identity leader at a government or at a financial institution, you're effectively managing your users with your hands tied behind your back. Sure, you want to make sure that you're doing certain things to protect them, protect their privacy, and ultimately you got to protect the brand of your organization because you don't want breaches to happen. Otherwise, they won't come back. But you do have to do like passwordless and MFA and all these things, but you've got to do it in such a way that you're prioritizing their experience. You're making that experience really good for them so that they don't get fatigued. So, and then you have to think of things like CCPA and GDPR or privacy. Like you can't hoard data on these people anymore because you don't own them. They're not yours. They're your customers or your citizens. So that to me is one of the biggest differences. Also too, like A bank's not going to send you a laptop or a mobile phone and say, use this when you log in. Back in the day, they used to send tokens and stuff, but they're not doing that anymore, right? So like you're using your own hardware to access other stuff. Contrast that to organizations. Sure, there's some organizations that have bring your own device, bring your own PC, bring your own Mac, whatever it might be, but the vast majority of organizations still managed by fleet. When they manage by fleet, it's theirs. They can do whatever they want with it. They can put it, use a enterprise mobility management and block things, monitor traffic, do all that. You can't do that with consumers. So that's the difference on the edges. B2B is in the middle, okay? Because you could get contractors and partners that need some fairly substantial access into your environment. A case in point would be like Department of Defense accessing like Lockheed Martin or Boeing. These are organizations that work very closely with DoD, right? But they're independent public organizations, and so they're like, okay, we'll give them vice versa. We'll give them some kind of level of access, but not too deep. And oh, by the way, we can push some policies on them, but we can't be too aggressive because they're not our employees. They're partners. So yes, there's legal agreements that are signed to ensure some kind of trust. But again, they can't be be as forceful, let's just say, as they could with their own employees. On the flip side, because it's almost like a Venn diagram, right, where they do overlap. On the side of where B2B overlaps with B2C, that could be gig workers. It could be other kind of contractors or partners where, again, you want them to access your systems to download marketing collateral or tools or whatever, but you want to make it easy for them because, especially say if you're a channel partner, if you're a vendor and you want channel partners to log into your portals to access sales collateral or whatever, and you make it difficult for them to log in, if you're not the only vendor in town, they're going to potentially go to someone else if they can get pricing, get quotes easier, if you're not making them jump through hoops. So I think all in all, there's privacy concerns and all of these security concerns, but I think it comes down to usability, and there's more usability focus, I think, on the B2C, B2B side of the equation than there would be on the B2E side.
Yeah, I kind of feel like one of the things I took from your answer is it kind of depends, which is the famous consulting answer.
Yes, and true. Analyst answer too, by the way.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that. All right.
That was like probably the second thing they teach you at Gartner and probably Forrester and others too. They're like, it depends. Remember that term.
Remember that term. I was thinking, the answer to that question probably depends on the use cases. Because I think of like some B2Es or B2B scenarios where it's like, hey, we just want to give this partner access to our SharePoint, or we want to give some of the partners, accounts so they can log in and, go on our VPN and use our project management tools.
Yep.
To me, though, that's like simple. That's just a minor extension to B2E. The real use case scenarios, I actually think that B2B can be much more complex than B2C. I think the authentication scenarios are pretty similar. And by the way, I think in the B2B scenario, you have a lot of traditional thinking. Well, I don't think you have a lot of it today. I think maybe some people still think this, but the idea of being able to use federation. Well, can't we just have our partners federate to us? Well, if you have 2 or 3 of them and they have an IDP, sure. But if you have hundreds or thousands, or they're not very complex, from an IT perspective, like federation is just not going to answer the whole question. You're going to have user management.
Exactly. And we've had federation for a long time. Yeah. We've had all this technology's been around for a while. Right? Problem solved, right? We should have solved this 20 years ago.
Exactly. Now, if you do traditional user management or you do delegated administration, that's where it gets really hairy, because I don't think there's very many commercial products. But that'll be kind of my next question to you. But getting into those hairy scenarios for managing those user populations, creating those whatever user journeys or administrative screens or process flows for how to allow your customers who are businesses manage their own users and do it in a way that, okay, when they actually have somebody leave their organization, they cut off their access because it's probably not going to be tied to their HR system. All those things. I think that B2B identity and access management is the toughest egg to crack.
Yeah. I think your point, like on the, it depends is really important, but just some examples, right? When I was at Gartner, and even now today, I still run a number of roundtables all around the world. But some that stick in my head on this topic, as a Gartner analyst, I would run workshops, and they were only for practitioners, right? And there were a lot of these like car manufacturers that were in there. And that one's an interesting one. So this is just one case, right? A B2B where they're like, hey,
yes,
cars are getting much, much more software oriented. They got updates. They got all kinds of things on them. Plus, obviously, all the traditional hardware combustion engines, or even if they're hybrid or electric, whatever. The dealers are like independent organizations that have their own IT and have their own thing, and they need access into those supply chains to be able to access all the software updates, all the training materials, all of that stuff. And so, some of these were very big, very well-known, prestigious companies that I met with, and they're all concerned about the model. And actually, some of the things we talked about, everyone, there was like this obsession with like decentralized identity, which, I myself and Mike Kelly and others at Gartner, we helped kind of define and get that on the hype cycle. But it's like, okay, this isn't really ready for this stuff yet, and we can solve some of this with federation and all this. But I think, Jim, to your point, the scale, the governance starts to get complex. And we're also delving into another area of like machine identities as well. When we think about all the operational technology, the all the different kinds of devices, because in the end, IAM has been focused just on humans, and that's great. But guess what? Even as we're doing this podcast here today, how many machines, and I'm talking like containers, software, applications, and actual physical devices that have to authenticate to each other, how many machines do we think are between all of us now, right now, just in recording this podcast? Tons of them. And they all live and die, and they all need to be able to authenticate. That to me is also the next frontier that we need to include in B2B, B2E, and B2C. And that just further complicates the notion of governance and authorization and authentication. So I think, again, it is appropriate that we have folks like yourselves, and you continue to lead the charge with identity at the center, because I think the next wave too is also going to be machine identity, going beyond human.
Well, I've read an article. It's interesting. I read this article about the human population. We hear it's gone from 5 billion to 6 billion. It's over 7 billion now. Mm-hmm. At some point in the next 10 years, I think it'll be at 8 billion. This article claimed, but it's going to probably top out around 8 billion. Not because the Earth doesn't have the resources, but that the level at which people are adding new, having children, it's just going to top out. And that by the end of the century, it'll still be around 8 billion people, if this article is right. So with all this technology and where we expect technology to be, 100 years from now, or whatever, 75 years from now, it's going to take so many people. And like, are we prepared to manage that? And I think what's going to have to happen is the humans are going to have to layer up. Just like, think about it. When we got into IT, most organizations had people who would manage the servers, and they would do these things. And then eventually they outsourced that. And now they have people who just manage through a console.
Yeah.
And thousands of companies are just managing all of their data center through a console. And, that one company's doing all that stuff, running the data center. So I think, especially with AI, it's, have to level up, level up, level up, because what you're bringing on or what you're talking about is like, it's just becoming more complex. And it's like, well, we can't just increase the number of people who actually get it. It kind of feels in some ways like society's getting dumber. So will we even be able to like have all those people that actually understand it? No, because the number of identities, the number of processes that are running is just going to exponentially grow larger. Something like technology, like AI, is going to have to run it all. And then the same number of humans, fewer humans, I'm not sure, will have to run the AI.
Yeah. I think you're edging on where we might see ourselves. I was going to make a joke about Ray Kurzweil. I think it was Ray Kurzweil was saying like, we'll, at least maybe in our lifetime, we'll be able to upload ourselves into a computer. So maybe that will be the reason why we flatten out at 8 billion and maybe go down, because
Elon's working on it.
Yeah, Elon's working on it, right? Neuralink and all this stuff. So maybe we'll eventually just be uploaded into machines. So.
It's like that show on Amazon Prime, Upload, is basically that same concept.
Yeah, that's right.
I have a slightly different viewpoint on it, Jim. I think you're right in that identities will grow over time. There'll just be growth, general growth. But I think it will be a much more elastic growth with the rise of machine identities being created and destroyed and being very ephemeral as workloads need to exist and no longer need to exist. So I think you'll see like much larger bands of, peaks and valleys versus that consistent kind of growth. I think there will be the growth, but I think you're going to see much bigger swings in like points of time. Like today we've got 500, tomorrow we've got 100, and then it's like 1,000, and then it's like 200. And it's like, it's just going to go back and forth because of that ephemeral nature of machine identities, especially if we get to a point where you don't have standing privileges all the time. You don't have these service accounts that just sit around doing nothing until they're called on. Yeah. They get created, they do their they do their job, and then they get deleted or removed or whatever it may be. Now that's until obviously sentient AI takes over.
But Jeff, I agree, and just taking a little bit of a commercial aspect here. When I think about things like pricing, I think if you think about the ramifications of that, it's like, well, we have to change our pricing models because. I think even in the identity space, if you're charging by user or you're charging by connection, right? It's like these things just get out of hand. I had worked with vendors as an analyst, coaching them on pricing models and stuff. They're like, "Oh, we're going to charge like per certificate." I'm like, "Well, you're gonna charge $200 per entity?" I'm like, so if they're using a Kubernetes cluster and they've got like in that elastic situation where they're like 1,000 containers, and then tomorrow they have 2. Like, what are you going to charge them for the 2,000 or the potential that they could go all the way up to 20,000? Like, I don't understand how we're going to square that peg, but we need to solve that. And I know with mobile device management, when that came out, like they did start charging people per device, and they went, wait a minute, a lot of people have like a tablet, a laptop, and a mobile phone. It doesn't make sense to charge one user 3 times, right? Just go by user. So I think we're also going to have a recomputation of all these pricing models. And I am seeing that, by the way, because Gartner analysts, we would do a lot of pricing reviews and all this. Like I had a pricing curve in my head for Okta and for Duo. Like someone could tell me what they were, what their size were, and I knew because I always had plotted their prices out. I see that's another way in the market that we see changing as well. I see a lot of customers saying like, okay, we want to do something, but I'm concerned about the scale of these projects and what this is going to mean for my budget and if I actually can do it. So I think it's upon ourselves to look at how we could recompute all that on the commercial side of things.
And by the way, I also agree with what Jeff said about the ephemeral IDs being created and destroyed. I think the challenge that I see as an IAM practitioner is like, how do I know that you're creating only the accounts that you need and you're destroying them? And I think that's bringing it back to ITDR conversation. If ITDR can start to set some rules around that and say, all right, well, you created these accounts and they did this and, broke whatever rules, and they raised the flags because things are happening so quickly. They're happening at much faster of a scale than humans can control. Those ephemeral IDs can't be managed like like the human IDs are created in a human resource system and then moved down to an IGA.
You couldn't keep up.
You can't keep up.
Yeah.
So you have to have the AI technology watching over it with rules that spits out alerts or takes action, because maybe alerts isn't going to be fast enough.
Yeah.
Right. If those accounts are being created because a hacker got control of the system, by the time you spit out an alert and people start calling people, your system might be all encrypted.
Yep.
Here's something scary for you. What if we get to the point where these workloads exist faster than a millisecond? So if you think about it, even if you were watching your screen, if it was faster than a millisecond, the majority of people wouldn't even see it, because your monitor refresh rate is at 60 hertz typically, at least in the US. Yeah. So what if you were creating faster workloads than 1 millisecond?
Yeah.
You wouldn't even see it. Even if you stared at the screen and didn't blink for 24 hours a day, you still wouldn't see it.
It's entirely possible, because I mean, look, even when, and I don't want to bring us down on a tangent here, but
we don't do that on this. We don't do
that.
Not
at all. Not at all. But like, quantum computing and things where, like, the dimension of time start to get a little bit funky. But just even when we think about modern day computer architectures, whether they're RISC-based processors or whatever, they're sequential. And one powerful thing with human beings is that we can model things, and we can conceptualize it, and we use analogies in our own heads, and we go, okay, I get it, I understand this, and then we can take something and scale it and shrink it, whatever it might be. But we're horrible. We are absolutely horrible at predicting the future. We suck at it. We do. Like, I know people say futurists, and hats off to them, but most of the time people suck at predictions, and there's a reason for that. And Gartner, I was so fortunate to go in a future prediction course at Gartner, and we talked about why. And it's just, we get in our own lens, and I think we also get in a lens with time as well. When Jeff, you're mentioning that we have our view of time, and I know this is crazy, right? But when people are like, hey, imagine if we met aliens and they had the ability to think like, 1 million thoughts in a time where it would take us to think one thought. No, that's what a computer is like, right? So it's not insane to think that you could have a machine that is doing something malicious, which we have malware doing this kind of stuff today. But if we take this to another level, in theory, that could happen. And these are, this is what people are concerned about with generative AI and then fueling that with all different kinds of things. But yeah, we're going into an interesting world where, look, I covered machine identity management at Gartner, and I would say, look, there are really, really good approaches and practices that we can take from human identity management and governance and apply it to machine. But there's that whole other level that both of you are talking about, the ephemeral nature and then the nature of like time dimension. And even when you start to get into other funky use cases, it can really break the IAM models we have today. So we have to be prepared for that. I'm not saying people need to freak out and run to the hills, but I think organizations that can at least think about that's coming in the future, and it's not that far away, we'll just be better prepared for it now today.
So David, I am impressed. You went a whole podcast without saying process, but you did say Identiverse twice.
I did.
So our lighter note that we're going to transition to is about Canada. But I'm going to hand it over to Jeff because I don't remember exactly how we are going to word the question. And by the way,
no, it's all good.
The curtain is always about at the Identity Center podcast is Jeff comes up with these questions. So I got to give you full credit
into my very weird mind, or what is in my consciousness at the moment. And somebody out there is probably walking like, oh my gosh, you guys are over an hour. Like, my legs are tired. Stop talking. Stop talking. All right. So let's wrap things up with a lighter note. And in honor of David and in honor of our Canadian friend, I'd like for you to teach us some Canadian slang that we can take back somewhere. Something that we can use in our everyday lives. I have spoken about the show before in my about my love of Letterkenny on Hulu, And I love degen for degenerates.
Yep.
And other folks out there. So I'd love to hear something from you, David. What's a good Canadian slang word that we can take back?
I'm going to make it very simple, and I'm going to use the infamous EH. And I'm going to, give you some use cases or scenarios where it can be used. Now, I live in Ottawa, Canada, which is considered more the eastern side of Canada. It's not the East Coast because that's even further away, like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. I'm in Ontario, but I border Quebec.
Newfies.
We say,
right?
What's that?
Newfies. I think I know
the
that
Newfies. Yes, they have a language into their own. Lovely accent. But out west, like Alberta, they tend to say HEY, like hey. But most Canadians the infamous term is EH. Now, how can you use this? It is an extremely versatile term. It can be a question like, "Hey Jim, why is it'd be like, why is your hat red, eh?" Question mark. So you could append it to a question. It could be a part of a statement. So it'd be like, "You're wearing a red hat, eh?" Right? So it could be used there. There are offensive ways you could use it as well. But it's a very versatile Canadian term. And I find myself sometimes, especially when I'm traveling in the US, I was in Boston last week and I was with a coworker. And I think I said, someone was giving me a shirt. It was a Transmit Security shirt. And they're like, "You don't have one, take it." And I was like, "This is a nice shirt, eh?" I didn't realize I said it. And I'm like, wait, was that more of a question? Or I think it was a statement in that case. So there's your little taste of Canada. Sorry, I can't virtually give you maple syrup or ice wine. But those are Canadian too, and they're very good. But I can give you the use cases of EH or A.
I appreciate that, Jim. I'm going to throw a gauntlet challenge down to you. You and I are going to go do an executive presentation in about a week for a client. I will buy you dinner if you can work A somewhere into that presentation.
I love it
with the clients.
Okay, but you're gonna buy me dinner anyway.
Maybe we'll see.
I need the idea. If it can be documented, maybe it'll be under NDA. Then I would love to hear how you used it, so I can evaluate the usage of it.
I'll have to remember to do a follow-up segment on that one, Jim. So there will be witnesses for sure. And I think we have a couple listeners who might be there, so they might be in on the joke, but maybe We'll see if we can work that one in. Okay. People's legs are tired. People's mouths and ears are probably tired as well. So
I've got to say what my favorite Canada show was.
Oh, you got one. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Trailer Park Boys.
Trailer
I haven't
Park
watched it in a long time. My kids really got into it and were watching it like crazy. And I had to look up what was a funny saying from that show. And I remember the one guy's name is Ricky, and his favorite Chinese dish was sweet and power chicken. Which I appreciate it because it was like, I recently got my hearing aid, but before that I would make mistakes like that, I'm sure.
Amazing. Classic shows. Excellent. We love it when we hear the Canadiana spreading south of the border.
Is that a good thing? Good. Okay. I don't want to do
I think so.
But I feel like that's also a little bit in the northern parts of the U.S.
We've got
Wisconsin, like that area.
Yeah, we've got our mascots. Ryan Reynolds.
Get a good don't you know,
Michaels, and all these. Don't you know, eh? Don't you know, eh?
Don't you know, eh?
All right, you guys are a bunch of degens, so we're going to start to wrap things up here. I guess, before we go, make sure people know about Identiverse. Use our code. It'll be in the show notes, 20% off. You only got a few days left for the early bird there. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcasts. We're also on Mastodon at IDAC Podcast, at infosec.exchange. We're going to have links to David's LinkedIn profile. I'm sure he's always happy to take questions and tell him how you're using A maybe in your life based on this discussion. Also, like to Transmit Security, transmitsecurity.com. A link to your book as well. Hopefully Marcel gets a version that has a table of contents in it, and we'll review his rating at some point. And also, obviously, a link to Identiverse as well. So Jim and I, we're on LinkedIn all the time, so feel free to connect with us. We're always happy to talk shop, engage, get ideas for shows, or even just send each other emojis and memes. I'm always about that as well. So also want to give a shout out to, I believe it's Leah, but she wrote a nice review of us on Apple Podcasts. She said, it's making security fun, and it's rare that discussions around cybersecurity are hilarious. Keep it up, guys. She's clearly very easily entertained if she thinks this stuff is funny, but we do appreciate her, putting that out there. So hopefully I got that. I tried to do some sleuthing around the name, and I think that's who that is. So Leah, if that's you, thanks so much. And that's how you can help us as well, right? Leave us a rating, leave us a review, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll keep the stuff coming your way. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. Appreciate everyone for listening. David, thank you so much for taking the time. Let's start the weekend off and go get ourselves a bottle of puppers or something like that. And thanks everyone for listening. Take care.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.